All right, take it away, Tony.
Yep, you got it. Hang on. So I'm just going to quickly review what we learned on day one, because what we learned on day one is actually a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today. So just kind of a refresher on the same topic. Today we're going to talk about how to make money selling Azure, how to quote it, right, and things to think about when quoting it. We're going to understand the components of Azure. We went over that the first day. We're going to understand reserve instances and Azure hybrid use. I think now that you had 2 days to kind of have that sink in, maybe when you see it again, you really have a full, complete understanding of it, and basically ask any more new questions about it. But these two components I really want you to understand. And then we're gonna end by sort of walking through a real opportunity, one or a couple of them maybe to kind of have you hone your skills on using the calculator. So we talked about how Azure was expensive, complex, and risky the first day. The terminologies and things that build the Azure practice, things you
Hey,
need to
Tony.
know. Yep.
Sorry, are you sharing your screen?
I am. No? You don't see it
No.
again? Weird. Oh, I never pressed the share button. Sorry.
There we go.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. Now we can see the Windows Virtual Desktop, your browser. There you go.
Yep. Let me see where my slides go. Yeah.
There we
so
go.
Yep.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about the components of Azure that we kind of reviewed on Monday. Talk about the hybrid use and the reservations, right? And then we're going to walk through a couple of opportunities so we can kind of get the hang of how to use a calculator, how to build a deal, and what to look out for, what to watch. So for those of you guys that are on this call that are on the technical team or technical side of things, even though this is about pricing and stuff, please don't tune out, because it's actually more important than the technical people that understand the pricing than the salespeople. So, and I say that all the time, and people kind of look at me funny, but when you go to picking the right machine types, you'll understand why. So we talked about the other day the different components in Azure that we want to basically focus on, and that you're not going to focus on all of Azure because that's impossible. We went through a lot of this already, but let's review this, right? So these reservations. So I'm going to do some testing now. Who's been paying attention and can tell me what a reservation is? I mean, the answer's on the screen, but in your terms, how would you explain a reservation? Can somebody want to raise their hands and volunteer?
Reserving capacity.
Yes. Hey, Ruby, what's up? What is that?
Reserving compute capacity.
Mm-hmm. And why should you reserve it?
It's cheaper.
Right. So it's a lot cheaper. And what happens if a customer cancels?
It's going to cost you 12% of the remaining balance.
Perfect. Oh man, I like this. This works. Yep, 12% of the remaining balance. Well, the answer's on the screen, but yeah. And then what's the Azure hybrid use?
You provide the licensing, and you get an even cheaper rate.
Right. And does anybody remember which VM sizes to buy them for and which ones to kind of avoid them for? No, it's okay. So I don't think I did want to go over that one, but yeah, you're right that when you buy the Windows Server licensing, you can get an even deeper discount, and with a combination of a reserve instance and a Azure hybrid use, you can get up to like an 85% discount on some VMs, right? So that means 85% off of your bill, which is a substantial discount and a big deal, and it's going to allow you to stay competitive and also sell cloud. Yep, and Dan said it's a commitment. Yes, it's a commitment. With the reserve instances, it's a commitment with the ability to cancel. With the Azure hybrid use, it's not a commitment. You pay upfront for it. You own the license. If your customer cancels, they own the license, right? There's no refunds for that. So I think now, why did I say sort of why pricing is more of a technical job than a traditional sales job? And it's really because we need to understand how these machines work, right? So In Azure, there's a ton of different machine types. But again, just like how I showed you what to focus on and what not to focus on, I would ignore all the machine types and only learn these 5. And I'll draw out on the whiteboard how I like to think about it. So you have this B series machine, which is best used for very light workloads where the CPU averages under 40%, right? So it's best for things like domain controllers and stuff. So just know that about the B series. The D series is your standard VMs, right? They're equally balanced between CPU and core, right? So your 2-core 8 gig of RAM, your 4-core 16 gig of RAM. Your E series are your more memory optimized ones. So basically, if you have a customer that has a line of business application that needs more memory, I'm not going to assign the D series to it because I know I need more memory. The better suitable VM sizes are the E series. And then if you have a customer that has a workload that needs more CPU, then I wouldn't go to a D series. I go to the F series, and you'll have machine types that have more CPUs. And I'll draw them out so you better understand them. But here, for those of you guys who want to take a little screenshot of it, just take a screenshot of this. It's a good reference. These are all the VM types that you'll ever use in Azure. Forget about the million other ones because that'll just confuse you, right?
A
And then
quick question on that, Tony.
Yep.
The D and E series, is that the only difference then? There's no throughput output or throughput differences or anything like that?
There are slightly, but the main difference is that you get more memory for only 15% cost over the D series. And the same for F series, you get more CPU for not double the cost and just a fraction.
Okay. One of the areas that I'm getting a little confused with is within each series, there's different types as well.
Yes.
The DV3 or the
Yeah.
DSV. Is there a place where I can get information on those and the main differences between them?
Yeah. So really, what I'm going to show you is what the latest machine types are. So basically, how this works, and Ruby, you're right that it's confusing because when Microsoft, think about it this way, when Microsoft buys these virtual machines in bulk, they can only buy so much of this generation's machine type, right? So next year, when the new Intel processor comes out, they're going to buy a ton load of that. But what do they do to the old machines? They can't just not sell them. They already bought them, right? People are using them, so they have to maintain them. So what they do is they slightly change the SKU name. So it might be a D2SV3, it might be a DS2V3, and that swapping of that 2 characters is a completely different generation. So it's tough for us because, if we're not kind of keen on what they mean and what the latest versions are, we can very easily pick an older generation, and it sometimes costs more than the current generation, right? So it's like if I gave you $1,000 and you go to Best Buy and you're going to go buy a computer, you're going to go buy the latest 10th generation i7 processor, right?
Yep.
But if the SKUs are confusing, you might have by accident clicked the 6th generation processor and paid the same or more money.
Yeah.
So in the Nerdio calculator, our calculator actually hides all the stuff that you shouldn't be looking at anyway. We hide a bunch of SKUs, and the SKUs that we show you in the Nerdio calculator, which we're going to talk about extensively today, only shows you the latest and greatest machines.
Okay.
So keep that in mind that we're already kind of providing certain guardrails to make sure that we don't pick the wrong machine types.
Okay. Appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm actually going to go and exit out of this screen and go to my whiteboard and demonstrate to you guys how I like to think about this, right? And when I show you it this way, I think it's going to make it's going to be a lot clearer. So remember, your D series machines, right, are your standard machines, right? So whenever I like to start thinking about, if I'm quoting, the reason why this is important is when I quote something, I can't just assign whatever amount of CPU and memory I have, right? In Azure, it doesn't work that way. You have to kind of pick from their list of predefined VM types. And there's different families, and you have to find one that matches what you are looking for very closely. And finding the right one and matching it closely is a difference between saving a lot of money and not saving a lot of money. In this demonstration, I'll show you what that means. So these are standard VMs. So standard meaning they're equally balanced between CPU and memory, right? So they have different types, right? So you have 2-core, 8 gigs, right? You have 4-core, 16 gigs, and they always double up. They always just double the size, right? So then you have 8-core, 32 gigs, and then you have 16 cores, 64 gigs, right? So these are your default sizes. And every time you double up, not only do they double up in CPU and memory, but they also double up in cost. So if this is, for example, $20 a month, this is 40, and this is 80, and this is 160, right? So that's how it kind of goes. Every time you go up in size, it doubles up in cost, right? So that's how you like to think about it. Now, let's say you knew nothing about other series families except for this one, right? This is the one that you should learn first. But let's say you weren't aware of what the differences were from the E's and the F's and the B's were, and this is all you knew, right? That the D series, they double up, right? So let's say you have a Sage application server, and it's running on a 2-core 8 GB RAM machine, and all of a sudden you upgrade to the latest version of Sage, and all of a sudden your customers are calling in and saying, hey, my Sage is running slow, what's going on, right? And of course, you're going to go and look at the machine, and you can say, oh man, the memory looks pretty high. Let me call Sage for support and see what's going on. So you're going to call Sage support, and the guy goes, oh yeah, the new version of Sage requires more memory. You got to give it more RAM, right? So as the administrator, what are you going to do? So can somebody tell me, volunteer, and say what they would do if they are using this VM size, but Sage is asking for more memory? What would you do?
Go to the E series.
You're cheating because I told you, but yeah, but yes, go to the E series is the right answer. But what if you didn't know about the E series? You would naturally think, oh, I need 16 gigs of memory. I'm just going to go double up, right? I'm just going to go switch my VM size, and not now I'm getting my 16 gigs of memory, but I also inadvertently got an extra 2 cores. Not the end of the world, but what's the end of the world is that it costs double the price, right? So you went from $20 a month to $40 a month, when all I needed was more memory, right? So the correct answer, I don't know who said it, but it's the E series. So the E series machines are memory optimized, meaning the VM sizes are in this manner. So they have 2-core, 16 gig of RAM. They have 4-core, 32 gig of RAM. Again, it doubles up, right? So 8-core, 64, 16-core, 128. And there are more after this, but most MSPs will stop at 16 cores because at some point, you're really not going to need more. You're going to maybe need 2 of of a smaller amount. So the benefit of going from a D to an E is that the E series is only 15% more money. So you go from a 2-core 8 gigs to a 2-core 16 gigs, giving you exactly what you need is the extra memory. You're not paying double the cost. You're only paying 15% more cost. So now that you knew there's an E series involved, right? And now you already have the upper hand, right? Now you can game the system and say, all right, this is a big puzzle. How can I effectively get what I want, but do it at the lowest cost? All right. So now you know that the E series is what you're looking for. You got the 16 gigs of RAM, and the guy never said you had a CPU issue. So why double up when you don't really need to, right? So that's how you like to think about it. And then from the CPU side, that's your F series. All right, so these are CPU intensive ones, and you can see that they start at 4-core, 8 gigs. Then it's 8-core, 16 gigs. So it's basically the opposite, right? Where you're not doubling up on memory, and you're doubling up on CPU.
So Tony,
right,
I had a question.
Sure.
So at what point would you upgrade the CPU rather than just the memory? What is the inflection point in which at which you would upgrade the CPU and not necessarily the memory?
Well, I mean, it depends on the server that you have assigned to that machine, right? So if you have a SQL server, and for whatever reason that SQL server doesn't really require that much more memory, but it requires a lot more CPU, then that would be an instance where you use an F-series machine, right? Or these Windows Virtual Desktop machines we talked about yesterday, how they're just normal machines. If you have a customer using Windows Virtual Desktop and they happen to do a lot of data crunching, right, then I might think about assigning them an F-series machine instead of a D or an E. So it's just options you pick, right? They all will function how they will. It's just because it's not like on-premise where you buy a VMware server, install ESXi, and then just divide and use the processor however I want. It's just that Azure has these family of VMs and they do things in very specific sizes. So we kind of had to adhere to the way that they size the VMs as opposed to having full flexibility like we do have on premise.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Tony,
And yeah.
Tony, does the clock reset, or does it, so if you switch out to a different processor, does it change to restart the term, or you still made that commitment, you still got the same commitment?
Yeah, so that's a perfect question. That's a really great question. So basically, when you buy a reserved instance, you're buying it off of a specific VM family, right? So there's a couple of things about reserved instances. When you buy them, you need to tell your distributor, right? What VM size it is, what family, which region, and the terms. Those are the 4 things you need to kind of tell them, right? So let's say I want to buy a reserve instance for a 2-core 8 gig of RAM in the DSV3 family in the US East region for 3 years on a monthly term. Those are all the information I have to kind of send to my distributor, so they don't ask you any questions, right? If you miss one of those components, they'll reply and say, you know, oh, what about how many terms you want, right? So they need to know those specific things for them to process the transaction. So let's say you bought a reserve instance for 3 years for a 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine. Now, what happens if all I did was double up on my, let's say I did need to increase both my CPU and memory, and I went to a 4-core machine. Now that reserve instance, think about a reserve instance. Remember those 2 meters I showed you? There's the compute meter and there's the operating system meter. Well, reserve instances just cover the compute meter. So what happens if you bought a reserve instance on a 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine and you move up to a 4-core in the same family? What happens is your reserve instance only covers 50% of this new machine type. And the other 50% is pay-as-you-go pricing. So think about like coupon stacking, right? Like you have you go up in size as long as it's in the same family, in the same region. And this is double the cost of this, then your reserve instance only covers 50% of this new VM size. Now you have 2 options. You can buy another reserve instance for another 2-core 8 gig of RAM to cover the other 50%, or you can exchange the 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine and buy a new 4-core 16 gig of RAM. But when you exchange that, you do enter into another 3-year agreement from that date. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Yeah, so you do enter another agreement when you do an exchange, or you leave the original one on the original term date and you buy just another 2-core 8 gig of RAM. Because think about it, 2-core 8 gig of RAM equals 1 4-core 16, right? And same for that. So if you switch from a 2-core 8 gig of RAM to an 8-core 16, then your reserve instance for the 2-core 8 gigs only covers 25% of that. So you want to always make sure that your reserve instances match what's really covered, right? So be careful when if you guys have deployments out there and somebody says to you, oh, the VM is slow, for you to go and tell a tech to go and just replace or go up to the next size. You can do that very easily in Nerdio or in Azure, but don't forget that when you shift in sizing, you have to also let your distributor know to cover for that, right? Or to make changes so your reservation is fully covered. That way you're getting, again, the best discounts. Now, what happens if you change from a 2-core 8 gig of RAM to a E series? Well, guess what? The VM size nor the family no longer matches, and you have to return the D series and get an E series. Again, that's just another email to your distributor. So, and this option to kind of go up and do the 50%, that's called reserve instance flexibility. That's a Microsoft term. It's called reserve instance flexibility. So there's actually another VM that is super interesting, and it's the B series machine. So B series machines are burstable, and what that means is that, and they reflect the same size as your D series. So you have your 2-core 8 gigs, your 4-core 16s, your 8-core 32s, 16-core 64. They follow the same pattern as your D series, but they're actually 56% cheaper than your D series, right? But why, right? Why is it that I'm getting the same gigs of RAM and same memory, but I'm getting it for 56% cheaper than the equivalent D series cousin? Well, Microsoft says this: anything you assign a B series machine, there's a threshold that for each VM that they assign, right? So for 2-core 8 gig of RAM, that threshold is about 40%. The next one's like 60%, like 80%. So basically, these thresholds basically mean that when you assign a VM a B series, they don't want you to use more than these CPU at any given time. So if you're likely using a 2-core 8 gig of RAM, but you assign it to a domain controller, you would know that your domain controller really isn't using above 10% most of the time, right? So that's a perfect workload for this 2-core 8 gig of RAM B series. I'm going to get it for 56% cheaper, and my threshold is around 40%. So when you're under 40% utilization, Microsoft gives you something called B series credits, right? And these credits are something that you can use to burst above and beyond 40%. So let's say most of the time you're kind of, building these credits, right? So your credit level kind of goes up, and all of a sudden you do a Windows update, or you're doing a backup job, or you're doing something with antivirus, and it's eating up all your CPU usage on that 2-core 8 gig of RAM. So anytime you pass 40%, it starts eating away at your credits. But when you're done and with that task, and that 40% is over, you start building that back up again. So you're kind of always on this roller coaster ride of using your credits and not using your credits. And as long as you have a healthy threshold, and the threshold's up here, and you never really surpass it, those are really good sort of use cases for these B-series machines because of the cost savings. So does everybody kind of grasp that concept? It's a weird one to think about. So basically, anytime you're underneath the threshold, and there's a different threshold for each VM, and you can look that up. There's a chart on Azure's documentation. But this is a way to kind of game the system again, right? Like if I know I have a workload that's barely being used, like let's say I have an IIS workload or a web server that most of the time isn't being used, I'm going to assign it to B series because I'm going to get it for 56% cheaper. And if I need my CPU for whatever reason, I can use my credits that I've built up. And as long as you're not using the CPU more than half the time, you're in a really good spot to get the B series for 56% cheaper cost. I think somebody made a comment on the chat. Let me read that out loud. Why would you have a DC as a VM instead of using Azure AD? So that's a very it's a question that I think people we need to know why, right? So let's just detour on that. And this has nothing to do with sort of kind of what I'm showing you, but I think a lot of people have questions about it, so I'm gonna answer that. And then I have another question. It says, do you gain and spend credits at the same rate, or credits get consumed faster than you gain them? Perfect question. You actually gain credits way faster than you can consume them. So if I boot up a new B series machine and I wait basically like 10 minutes, I've built enough credits to use the machine at 100% CPU for about 40 minutes. So it builds really fast. Yeah, so it builds really fast. But there's other things about the B series that you have to also know. Every time you reboot the B series, all your credits go away, right? But because it builds so fast, it doesn't really matter, right? So if you have a domain controller in a B series, for example, I would always maybe do your patches and reboot on a Friday night, maybe. That way it has all weekend to build it up, right? But you don't need all weekend to build up. If you wait an hour, you would have had enough credits to burst 100% for about 4 hours. So in the old days with RDS, people would assign RDS servers, B series machines. So think about it this way. At night, nobody's using the environment. You would have built enough credits to burst for about 11 hours the next day at 100% usage. So if your customer is only using the environment for 8 hours a day or 8.5 hours a day, you don't even consume all your credits before the next evening hits, and you build that back up again. So think about it that way, right? If your RDS hosts are on B series, now I don't recommend that because there's many other reasons why you shouldn't use B series for an RDS or WVD host, but people used to do it that way. And if you think about, your customer using it for 8 hours a day, but, at night you're not using it enough to, build up enough credits to burst for 11 hours, you're net positive, right? Okay, so Brian asked, what are the penalty if you go over the credits? If you go over the credits, your penalty is you get threshold and your CPU locks down at 40% or 60% or 80% depending on which VM you pick. So if you go over your credits, you get throttled. Okay, so I'm going to go back and answer Peter's question about why you want a domain controller as a VM instead of using Azure AD, right? So I'll come back to this, so we'll let some of the stuff sink in. So we have to understand what Azure AD is. So Azure AD is not a replacement for a domain controller. Azure AD is just a directory for Office 365 objects, right? So you cannot join a PC directly to Azure AD unless you're using Microsoft 365 via Intune. Then you can do that, right? And that only works with Windows 10 PCs. Now, if you have a server, right? Let's say you have a VM that's a server. Let's say you have an app server in Azure. You cannot join an app server to an Azure AD directory, right? So because you can't do that, you have two options, right? You can either spin up a VM-based domain controller, which is on a B series on a 3-year reserve. It's about $28 per month, right? $28 per month. Or you can spin up what's called Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Directory Domain Services. So it's AADDS for short. You might have seen this term around. But this is $110 per month. So an AADDS is basically a platform as a service version of the domain controller, but actually it doesn't have all the same functionality, right? So if you want maximum flexibility and you want the lowest cost, a VM-based domain controller is still your best bet to either join your computers directly to it, right, PCs, or servers directly to it. But you cannot join servers directly to Azure AD. And then your domain controller would talk to Azure AD via Azure AD Connect. Right, so everybody should have Azure AD Connect installed on their domain controllers to sync that object. But that, yeah, so right now there is no way to join a server directly to Azure AD. So hopefully that answers that question or you know, helps you differentiate. So there's really 3 things. There's this, which is kind of the center of everything. And you have things like a domain controller syncing via Azure AD Connect, or you have something like Azure Active Directory Domain Services talking to Azure AD, and you can join servers to this. So the reason why this exists is you can join servers to that.
Yes,
So
that answered my question. Thank you.
yep. And
Of course, we also have to have the management portion and patching portion onto the DC, which drives the cost past $28 a month. But
right, so maybe you add your continuum or whatever services you have. And yes, you don't have to patch this guy, but this guy actually comes with a lot more problems than most people think. If you actually deployed an Azure ADS environment, it's technically not even the same domain as this, right? So let's say, you know, so you don't want a complex environment, right? So when I say complex environment, you have a customer with an on-prem domain controller. It's called contoso.local. Right, you spin up an Azure AD environment, they have contoso.com. And then you spin up an Azure Active Directory Domain Services, it's a specific Azure domain that's a different domain. So now, from a domain perspective, now you have to manage 3 separate domains. That's a problem, right? So it's not that the cost is more. Yes, the cost is more, but we try to avoid it because it introduces way more complexity than it needs to. All right.
okay.
Yep. So any questions about the VM sizing?
Tony, I
So-
think you're probably, that'll be maybe something we want to circle back around and maybe have another webinar just on this one more time here in a week or 2 after everything's sunk in.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
But does it kind of help how you think about how to decide what VM size to use? I mean, it really, you know, if you're given any workload, let's say you have a Sage server on premise that's a 2-core 8 gig of RAM, you first have to decide, all right, am I using a standard VM size, or does it need more memory, or does it need more RAM, or more CPU, or can I get away with the machine running in a burstable capacity where I'm not going to reach my threshold? Right, so that's how you want to think about it. But you know, I can, you know, so going back to the slide, it kind of explains all that. But I think drawing it out visually helps, should help you guys think about it a little bit easier. Okay, so let's go through you know, setting up in a new environment, right? So we're going to spend the rest of the time probably on the Azure Calculator or the Nerdio Calculator. So those of you guys who don't have access to Nerdio Calculator, you should go to getnerdio.com and sign up for a Nerdio trial. The Nerdio trial will have the Azure Calculator built into it. So once you get into Nerdio, you go to the billing tab and you go to the cost estimator. And today we're gonna basically focus on two areas. So desktop as a service eventually is going away. So just know that there's two types of workloads you could do inside of Nerdio, or Nerdio can help with, right? Either you have a client that has a domain controller and a file server, and it's something simple. You can use infrastructure as a service, meaning you don't need virtual desktops, you don't need any of that. And all you need to do is host a VM or two in a cloud. And once you get into any type of line of business application where you have, QuickBooks or Sage or TigerPaul and things like that, you may want to use IT as a service, right? Because there's some kind of virtual desktop component that has to kind of that are used to kind of publish your application. So let's start with the simple one. So let's say you have a customer that where all they need is a domain controller file server combo, right? So one server that kind of does both things. So I think that's from a simple perspective, that's what some people might have. So can somebody tell me what VM types they would use, given sort of that chart I showed you before, or how to think about it? Do I use a D series or should I use a B series?
D.
I think
Somebody
it'd
said
be.
D.
I think it'd be as in Bravo.
Yeah. Okay. So I think B is a better one, because Bs are, remember, 56% cheaper, and most of the time your workload is under 40%, right? So if I do a B series machine, and you can see the difference, right? Let me just show you quickly what the cost difference is. So let's pick US East as an example. So a D2 SV3, which is your 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine, your regular pay-as-you-go pricing is $137, right? Remember, with the B series, you're going to do a reserve instance, which knocks the price down to 94, and you might want to do Azure hybrid use, which knocks it down to 26, right? But with the B series, it's slightly cheaper. It's $22, right? So this one's not much of a difference. But let's look at a larger one. Let's do a D8 SV3, which is that pay-as-you-go cost being $548. Get the 3-year and the Azure hybrid use, knocks it down to 107. Right, now let's look at the equivalent size B series, B8MS, 8-core 32. You can see that even the pay-as-you-go price is already $266, and if you do a 3-year, it brings you down to 114, and if you do the reserve, it gives you $91. Right, so it's a little bit cheaper. So I'd rather go the cheap way if I'm not sacrificing my performance, right? So if my machine does not require high CPU utilization, I'm going to always pick a B.
And Tony, that cheaper would also equate to more. You would get credits if you weren't actually using the whole thing, right? So
right. You would still gain credits,
cheaper, right?
Yeah. So in reality, you can use that CPU at 100% when you need it, right? Whereas the D series, you can use it 100% 3 years straight, and Microsoft doesn't penalize you. Whereas if you use a B series and you try to use 100% CPU 3 years straight, it would bottleneck you at some point at 40% for the rest of the time, because you're not building enough credits for you to sustain to grow above 40%. But a perfect example is the domain controller, right? So B2MS, so we'll call it a 2-core 8 gig of RAM domain controller, and we'll also, however many gigs of data you need, right? There's 3 different types of disks. They're all redundant. They're all secure, meaning they're encrypted at rest and in transit, and they're redundant. So you don't need to worry about whether or not something's a RAID 5 or a RAID 10. The whole concept of a RAID no longer exists in Azure, but there's a new thing you have to kind of know and worry about in Azure, right? So there's different types of disks. You have your standard spinning disk, which are your cheapest cost disks. And then you have your standard SSDs, which are your equivalent to your Samsung Evo 850 type of disks. And then you have your premium disks, which are your HP Enterprise 3-par EqualLogix type of enterprise disks, right? For the best performance, I would always go a premium disk, but there are some things that you don't really need that much performance for. So if you're hosting nothing but some PDF files and Word documents on here, I would go to a standard disk. So for a customer with a 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine with a standard disk of 256 gigs of data, and that's all I'm looking for, then well, let me switch it back to US East. then that's all I need, right? So, so here's that question again, right? Do you pay for Azure Hybrid use for a B series machine? Can somebody tell me if you pay for Azure Hybrid use for a B series machine? Yes or no? Should I take advantage of that discount?
I would say
Yes.
no.
You said no, Jeremy?
On the B series, right?
Right,
'Cause
right.
it's
Okay,
not
so
enough saving. Yep.
yeah. So
I'd say
I
yes.
think let me explain why it's really a no for the B series. There's some rules to this, but there's also a few exceptions, and the B series is a weird exception. So I didn't really bring this up before because it's sort of it's very confusing. But let's take again that D8 SV3 example, right? If I do the reserve instance, I get the big discount. If I do the Azure Hybrid use, I'm actually saving $268 a month, right? So if my cost of the license, a cost of a Windows Server license is only $531, if I'm saving $269 a month, it only takes me 2 months to pay for that license, and I have the next three years to kind of get that big discount, right? But if you look at the B series machine, it actually doesn't make sense. So if you do pay-as-you-go on a 2-core 8 gigs, it's already $66, right? If I do a 3-year reserve or commitment on the 3-year, it knocks it down to $28. But look what happens if I try to pay $531 to try to get a discount from my license. I'm only saving $5.84, right? So why is that? I have no idea. Don't ask me. That's just how it is, right? So if you don't want to remember this, all you have to do is remember this right here, which I can send to you guys, but maybe I'll paste it into the Zoom chat here somehow.
Hey,
I'll do it
Tony,
a little bit later.
I did email that out, and it's part of kind of a tips and tricks that I'm going to be sending out to everybody. So
Okay, yeah. So if you want the best, absolute best margins, you know, you can know it like I knew it really well, or if you don't want to know it, just remember these 2 things, right? Always purchase a 3-year reserve instance for any size VM. It always makes sense. You're always going to save money no matter what. But should you always take advantage of Azure Hybrid use? Yes, right? So always take advantage of Azure Hybrid use except for B series machines and except for WVD session hosts, right? So WVD hosts are Windows 10 operating system machines. They're not Windows Server. So you don't need to buy a Windows Server license in order to get the Azure Hybrid use benefit or the discount. And we already just did an example of why you should not buy it for the B series machines. Cody asked a question, if you have some B series domain controllers and D series and E series, how do you set all of them to, how do you set it so you don't use the B series? All right, so here's another thing about these B series machines. When you buy a reserve instance from your distributor, the reserve instance automatically gets applied to your VMs. Like there's nothing you need to do except to tell your distri that you want to buy them, and once they've told you they've ordered them, you're good. When you buy the software licensing for Windows Server, Microsoft is completely on the honor system. There's no CD key. Well, there is a key that they give you, but you don't really need to enter it anywhere. When you buy a license through your distributor for a license, you actually have to go to the Azure portal and go and turn it on. So I'll give you an example of how you actually turn that on. So I'm logged in my Azure portal, and let's say I have 2 VMs, right? Let's say this DC01 or this domain controller VM is a machine that I just bought a license for, right? Now, how do I tell Microsoft I bought the license, I get a discount, right? You basically go to the domain controller, you go to the properties, and you go to the configuration tab. You actually have to tell Microsoft that you've already purchased the Windows Server license, right? And then you hit save. That's all you need to do. When you do that, you know, and nothing stops you from going to all your machines and turning this on, right? You're kind of just out of licensing compliance. So it's based on the honor system. You go and buy it. There's not a place to put in a key. You have to come to your machine and physically go and press the buttons to turn it on. So Cody, hopefully that answers your question. You can selectively turn it on for each type of VM, yes or no, to turn this on or off. Okay, yep, he said perfect. So going back to this, if all I have is a domain controller and I have a B series, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to actually do a Azure Hybrid benefits. Now I can if I want to, if I go and select CSP subscription as the licensing model that I want to use, it will discount me, but you can see that it discounted it by very little, right? If you pay attention to the little box, discounted it very little. So, but I'm still expected to pay $582, right? So basically the $5 savings over 3 years does not surpass or does not equate to more than $531, which means I'm not going to pay something to lose money on it, right? Like the other one, I pay $538. I gain about $9,000 back at the end of the 3 years with the savings. On the B series, I actually lose money. So just be careful of that. For the reserve instances, remember the rule was always do it no matter what. So we're going to do it 3 year. Do you want to use backup? Yes. Do you want to use out of region disaster recovery? Yes or no, right? So in region backup is basically 3 copies of your data in the same region. Out of region backup is 3 copies in the same region, and 3 other regions also have 3 copies in their region. So it's really increasing your SLA from 99.119 of redundancy for in-region backup, and the out-of-region SLA is about 99.169 of uptime or guarantee data integrity. So again, you pick what you want, and here's your quote. Do you want a site-to-site VPN? Right. So the default site-to-site VPN in Azure is called a VPN Basic Zero SKU, and it gives you 10 tunnels and up to 100 meg throughput across all of them combined. So if you have a customer with multiple offices and you want to connect multiple offices to use this one domain controller, as long as it's under 10 offices, you can stay with the VPN Basic Zero SKU. And that only costs $24. You can see that. And then hybrid AD, if you want to bring an on-prem domain controller into the cloud, you can use hybrid AD for that. It's a process that basically pulls your on-prem domain controller, makes a copy of it, and sets it up into Azure, and has it hosting in Azure. And then on-premise, you can choose to leave that there or go ahead and completely decommission that if you want. And then on-ramp region is basically in a calculator adds an additional region. So remember, Azure's got 58 global regions, right? If you have a customer that maybe on opposite sides of the country, you might have somebody in the East Coast and West Coast, you can add additional regions and add it to your network so you can deploy resources closer to the other subset of customers if that's something you guys need. And then over here, there's various little miscellaneous costs in Azure that we try to estimate here. So we have storage operations, we leave it at 10 cents per gig. If all you're doing is domain controller traffic through the VPN tunnel, I'm going to say your bandwidth is no more than 10 gigs per month, right? You enter your CSP discounts here. You enter your, for Azure, and your CSP discount for reserve instances. You pick your region, you pick your currency, and you click view cost. And it's going to tell you exactly how much this costs per month, right? So $169 per month, you're going to get a domain controller of a 2-core 8 gig of RAM with 256 gig of data disk. And here's sort of the little ancillary sort of properties that Azure gives you for Azure how we came up with the full cost of Azure. Now I want you to pay attention to this little bottom line, right? So this bottom line says this: if you're choosing to pay your reserve instances up front, your reserve instance is $910. And I actually like to use this number to calculate my penalties, right? So in this particular example, let's just add a little bit more on here. Let's just say I have a IIS server, and the IIS server is a D4SV3, something a little larger, as an example. You can see that, based on that, it's calculating the total worth of your 3-year reserve instances. Remember, you're getting into a 3-year contract with Microsoft, and to Microsoft says your 2 VMs for 3 years is worth this much money, right? 3,010. So the best way to calculate the penalty, remember the penalty was just 12% of what's remaining. So you take 3,010, and let's divide that by, let's say 3 years, right? And that means your annual worth of this 2 servers to Microsoft is about $1,003 per month. So if somebody happens to cancel 1 year in and you have 2 years left of your agreement, you have to pay a 12% penalty on the 2 years, right? So if this represents 1 year, I'm just going to multiply this by 2. This is my 2-year worth, right? It's $2,006, and I just take 12% of that. So when you guys are doing your agreements or when you guys are doing your quotes, you may want to put in a little fine print that says if you cancel within 1 year, you're going to incur a cost of this or something, right? At least that's what you have to pay for. You can charge your customer 15% if you want or whatever to cover your 12%, but that's what you want to put down in your quote to be very upfront with your customer and say, hey, you know, if you cancel, there's a penalty of, you know, maybe not 12%, you charge them 15%, but it's very fair, right? Microsoft doesn't charge you too much to get out of the agreement. You know, usually the penalty is less than 1 month managed services profits anyway. So, you know, it's usually not an issue, but you definitely want to not have that come up. You know, just make sure it's in your quoting, in your proposal. So I'll spend the next 15 minutes, you know, quickly going over the IT as a service. So IT as a service is, you know, an environment that you're going to use Nerdio to deploy with virtual desktops. So let's say you have a customer with, you know, 25 users. You're going to quote Windows Virtual Desktop. This next line item asks for how many dedicated desktops do you need, right? So after, you know, so 25 users, let's say there's one owner that wants his own dedicated desktop for some reason, right? And it's usually not, you know, a performance reason why, right? It's usually because he doesn't, you know, he wants to install some weird application that nobody else uses, and you just want to give it to him because he's the boss, right? You maybe want to give him one machine, but most of the time people don't do a dedicated desktop just because it is more cost. Let's just say, for example, we'll do one. How many users require graphic intensive needs? We'll say you use 0 for this one, but basically what this is saying is anybody who uses CAD or CAM software or like an AutoCAD, Revit, Bluebeam, things like that, you can specify the number in here and we'll calculate how many GPU machines we're going to quote you. But let's say you have your domain controller, 2 core 8 gigs of RAM. Now the file server, and I want to be careful, there's a second exception, right? Just because a file server is also less than 40% most of the time, I'm actually not going to use a B series for that. And the reason is for that is because different series have different maximum IOPS capabilities, right? And the use for this file server is for Windows Virtual Desktop to put its FSLogix profiles in. So remember yesterday's session, we talked about FSLogix profiles being VHD disks that store the entirety of the customer's data. All right, that data, that VHD needs fast IOPS, right? It needs a disk that runs really fast. And if you pair something with a B series machine, the B series machine has a very low threshold for IOPS capability on a disk. Meaning if I put a premium disk on a domain controller, I'm actually going to bottleneck the speed, the potential of my premium disk because my B series machine is too slow. Not that the machine is slow, but the maximum IOPS capability is very slow. Right? So if I intend to use fast performance disk, I should never use a B series machine. So let's say for 25 users, I'm going to have 512 gigs of premium disks. I'm going to pair that with a 2 core 8 gig of RAM machine. All right. So this is just asking how much map drive data they have, and then you want to account for the VHD profile sizes as well. I like to use about 10 to 15 gigs per user as an estimate to kind of estimate how large my profiles are going to be, right? And people with large mailboxes, those are sort of an issue, right? If you have a large mailbox and you don't do any archiving, your mailbox could be upwards of 25 gigs per OST file, right? So you want to maybe account for that. If you know you have a client going to Azure, you've tried talking to them about archiving and they refuse to do it for whatever reason, you want to, you know, estimate that into your premium disk cost because it's going to cost you more because you need larger storage. So let's say there's a TigerPaw server, right? And we'll use a 4-core 16 gig of RAM for that. And maybe the TigerPaw has a database that is, I don't know, another 256 gigs of data, something like that. So you kind of just add as many servers as you want to host in Azure. And as you add them, you know, pay attention to the little box. It's going to go increase while you do it. So we talked a little bit about yesterday, but Microsoft 365 Business is the license you want to bring if you're using Windows Virtual Desktop. That's because it actually has the license for Windows Virtual Desktop without having to pay a little bit more. So whatever they have today, whether it be Business Premium or E1 or even E3 for $20 a month, you should swap them out for Microsoft 365 Business. It's the same price, $20 a month, but you get a lot more for it. So what I'm going to do here is actually just quote out 25 users, assuming that they don't have anything, and they're going to get M365 Business. Now, Windows 10 Enterprise, you actually don't need that if you have M365 Business. The reason why this is here is because if you want to stay on E3 for whatever reason, you need to bring a separate a la carte Windows 10 Enterprise license. So we'll move on. Now, Azure Hybrid use. Because I have some D series machines here, I'm actually going to take advantage of this, right? So I'm going to say yes to that, or I'm going to select CSP subscription, which is the model I'm going to purchase it with. And again, that drops the price down. So you can see what happens if I choose no commitment to both things. My cost is $870. If I commit to both things, you can see my price drops pretty much by half, right? $403. So same questions as before. Do you want in-region backup? Let's just say yes. Do I want out-of-region DR? Maybe I don't have a compliance need to do it, and I'm comfortable with the 11 nines of redundancy. I'm good there, so I don't need that. I do a site-to-site VPN.
Hey, Tony, real quick,
Yep.
how much does the outer region DR add? Just real quick.
It depends on how many disks you have up here. So it's a calculation based on how much data, right? So if you have a really, really small amount of data, then it's not going to really add much. So in this case, it's going to add $8 per user.
Okay.
You know, so it goes from actually $490 to $702. So, you know, it's a big chunk.
Okay.
You know, so it's not trivial. So we see clients doing this only if they have a compliance need to do it, right? If they're HIPAA compliant or you need, you know, you're working with a state or local government agency, you need that offsite for you know, price is not the issue at that point, right? You just need it. But most of the time, people are okay with, you know, your 3 copies of your data in one region. So yeah, we keep answering the same questions. Now here's the fun part. You get to decide how large these Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts need to be, right? So you have to think about it from a terminal service perspective, right? So I'm going to actually adjust the user to core ratio to 3. And if 25 people log on to my environment and I have a single box to share it with, how large does my box need to be? Think about it from that perspective. So 25 users, actually, I would probably do like an 8-core, 64 gig of RAM. But if you're not sure, I would just even double that. I would do a 8-core, you know, 16-core, 128 gigs of RAM machine. And that way I'm oversizing it on purpose. And I deploy it that way. And if a customer doesn't need it, great, I can go back. But if a customer, you know, if you size something too small and your customer needs more compute power, now you're eating against your margins because you decided on how much to sell this for based on what we told you it was, right? So if you're not sure, you know, the best thing to do is if you have a customer with an existing terminal server environment, you have something to compare it against. But if you have no prior experience with terminal server even, and you need to kind of estimate the size, you know, come to us. We'll help you with right sizing it. But you know, whatever you think it is, maybe just add the next size up just to over provision. That way you can always go back and gain more margin versus eating against your margin if you made a mistake, right? So bandwidth, $1.50, storage operations, all this is the same stuff. Now that one VM size, that personal desktop I talked about, that boss having, maybe he gets a 4-core, 16 gig of RAM machine, right? So 4-core, 16 gig of RAM machine. And then I have my discounts for my CSP, again, my region, my currency, and if I click view cost, now it's telling me that for 25 users to have a domain controller, a file server, a TigerPaw server with all these disks, backup storage, everything in the cloud, running 100% of the time, with a 16-core, 120 gig of RAM machine to share amongst 25 people, it's only going to cost me $6 a user per month, with the 365 licensing included, right? So if you take this whole price, and what's missing from this price is, you know, obviously your Continuum or your RMM tools and your antivirus tools, but other than that, this is really close to what your total cost of ownership is going to be. So if you add those RMM and AV tools, you maybe at $65 per user. So how much can you mark this up to or buy and still sell it and stay competitive, right? So a lot of our partners are somewhere between the 180 to 250 range all in. Some people like to kind of sell it on the per user per month cost and just bundle everything in. Some people like to split everything out by line items. But I've seen people do like, you know, easily 70% uplift on this. So this is, let's say with the tools and everything, it's $65 your cost multiplied by 1.7. You know, you're looking at selling this for 110 bucks per desktop, right? Something like that. If you don't want to bundle in managed services, you want to keep that line item separate.
Hey, Tony, that's so that 110, everybody, you guys, all our tag members are familiar with that 110, 115 a desktop, are, you know, per seat price for all in managed services. So basically here, you know, when Tony's saying, you know, sell us for 180 to 230 or so, if you take that one, you know, that 115 we've been talking about and this 110 here, you've got two and a quarter now.
Right, so you're within that range, yeah.
Yeah, pretty easy to see how that math worked out, how we basically doubled the per seat costs based on this, but also it's important to note what Tony did say was we're also selling Office 365 in here, and where normally we wouldn't get a 2 times markup on Office 365, we'd get maybe a 12% margin. We're actually marking it up 2x in this 225 here.
Right. So yeah, that's a good point. And if you don't want to, mix and convolute that, you can kind of strip out the Microsoft licensing. That lowers your cost of $42 a seat. So even if you get $42 a seat, multiply that by 1.7 again, you're at 71, and you add that 115. Now you're at that 180 range. So hopefully that shows you exactly how that works. But yeah, any other questions? We're at the top of the hour.
Got a few technical questions. Maybe we should leave those for the next week. Cody and Scott, you mind?
Yeah.
Or we got 2 Codys and Scott.
Yep. Yeah, we'll talk about that next week. I think on Monday we're going to talk about the actual deployment and actually how to do the migration and all that stuff. And then on the last day we'll talk about how to troubleshoot some of these WVD environments, right? What we've seen, right? We've seen thousands of deployments at this point. They all, boil down to just a handful of different issues that we see all the time. But yeah, we'll answer the rest of the questions on Monday.
Yep. All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everybody. Once again, I'll send out a recording of this, and I'll also add these questions onto that too, so we don't forget about them next week, and we'll keep rolling. Thanks, everybody.
All right.